First of all, I want to apologize for the delay in getting our broadcast going tonight, but we're ready to go. I'm Brian Darling, and I want to welcome you to Ensuring Liberty's virtual town hall. And tonight, we're going to be talking about a very important issue to all Americans, financial services reform. Now, this bill is one bill in a series of bills that this Obama administration has moved forward on that'll take over a sector of our economy, financial services. Now, at first glance, you wouldn't think the idea of reforming financial services would be a bad idea. But when you look at the details of this bill, this permanent bailout of Wall Street, it turns out to be a very bad idea. Just like when you look back, it was very important for Congress to take a hard look at reforming health care. But Obamacare really wasn't the answer, and it really wasn't what the doctor ordered. What we're doing right now is we're sitting down. We're going to have a conversation, an educational conversation, so you can learn more about this bill and this legislation that's pending right now and being debated before the United States Senate. And joining me here is Steve King, congressman from Iowa and a member of the Small Business Committee, who has some opening statements. Talk a little bit about the bill.
Well, thank you, Brian. I sit on the Small Business Committee. I've been a businessman for most of my life. I started a business in 1975 I started with a negative net worth of $5,000, and I talked the banker into loaning me 100% to buy an old beaten-up bulldozer. So I'm still here after all these years, and sold that business to my oldest son when I came to Congress. And he's actually the last 4 years have been the best 4 years King Construction ever had. So I kid with him a little bit about it was good to get me out of the way and let him take it up to another level. But I lay this out because having built a business from scratch, you learn a lot of the pieces that have to do with necessarily building capital and operating a business, meeting payroll, facing the regulations, the taxes, the financial component of this too, because it was a capital-intensive business that I was in, a heavy equipment, earth-moving, site development work. So that is my background. And I also serve on the Ag and on the Judiciary Committee, and we get some of these issues in front of the Judiciary Committee. I'm the non-lawyer on the Judiciary Committee, I tell them, and so that's the perspective and the background. This financial, well, I'll call it financial reform bill, the Barney Frank bill that passed the House last December, sent over to the Senate, where Chris Dodd has been working this over. I can't think of any two people I'd rather not have trying to fix America's finances rather than Barney Frank and Chris Dodd. And the first point I would make about this financial reform bill is that it does nothing to reform Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. In fact, it's being debated while they're asking for billions more money to put more capital in because they're going downhill. And when the executive order of the president's that was issued right before Christmas last year, that finally took over the balance of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and turned it into a completely national organization where it was quasi-GSE before. And at one time, Fannie and Freddie were privatized. They were completely private, and they moved over into quasi, and now they're completely government. The liability that's there for the taxpayers, the contingent liability, is $5.5 trillion. And yet there's not one word of anything that tightens up the regulation in Fannie and Freddie in this bill. And that's something that I pushed for a long time. I want to lay a little bit of the history out about how we got to where we are. And this will be very much the abridged version. But if we'd go back to 1978, the Community Reinvestment Act, and that was the legislation that required lenders to make bad loans in bad neighborhoods. Fannie and Freddie were picking up those bad loans given in bad neighborhoods on the secondary mortgage market. By the time we got into the early 90s, Acorn figured out that the Community Reinvestment Act wasn't strict enough for their purposes, and Fannie and Freddie didn't have enough latitude in underwriting requirements. So Acorn and other entities lobbied for a refreshed, new, modern version of the Community Reinvestment Act that demanded that more bad loans in more bad neighborhoods be written, and it lowered the underwriting standards for Fannie and Freddie. And then Acorn put themselves in a position where they actually passed judgment on the lending institutions as to whether they were meeting the requirements of the Community Reinvestment Act. All of that was poison for our financial markets, and that came into the era when we had the dot-com bubble was bursting, and we had then Alan Greenspan looking at that shrinking economy, thinking we will build that back up with a housing market that's accelerated by low interest rates. low, unusual interest rates in the middle of the Community Reinvestment Act, Fannie and Freddie's lower standards of underwriting requirement, and the standards of mark-to-market accounting also is another component of this. All were a witch's brew that put us in the situation that we're in today. And you would think that you would have hearings in the United States Congress before Barney Frank's Financial Services Committee and Chris Dodd's Senate Finance Committee that would examine what went wrong financially, put it into the record, and start to fix it. But instead, it's been a long litany of protection by those two individuals who have plenty of vulnerabilities of their own, and they've written the financial reform bill out of the House and to the Senate now that puts the federal government in the business of having the ability to control every single business in America. Every credit transaction, I should say, in America, and all businesses deal with some kind of credit transaction. All the way from the investment banks' highest finances of engagement in transactions that might be a substantial takeover, all the way down to the dental bill. If you want to set up a monthly finance for your children at your local dentist and pay it every month for the braces on your child's teeth, the federal government under this legislation would have the ability to stick their nose in that and regulate that transaction, Brian.
Well, let's set the table. I mean, the House has passed one version of this. Some people call it the financial reform bill because it's so bad. Some people call it a permanent bailout authority for Wall Street. The Senate's in the midst of a debate right now. They're changing the bill. When Senator Dodd's committee marked up the bill, it took 15 minutes to mark up, so it wasn't a very open process. So your average American doesn't really know what's in this legislation. So I guess the first question would be, how will this affect the average American, and will it be good or bad for them?
I think it's bad for the average American. I think it's bad for every American because it sticks the federal government into the business of making decisions for free enterprise. Now, I think there are a number of things in the, I'll call them minutia. The broad picture of this is that it's another huge sector of our economy that the federal government is taking over. And if you add that to a long list of sectors of the government the federal government is taking over. So aside from that, which is the most dangerous thing that suppresses our vitality and just almost crushes free enterprise, how does it affect the average American? It makes credit harder to come by. There'll be fewer lending institutions. There are higher regulations. There'll be more regulators looking over the shoulders of the lenders. And there'll be a lot of transactions that just don't take place because the federal government will be in business of doing that oversight. And people will decide they just don't want to do business with the federal government. So I think that it will make capital harder to find, harder to come by. There'll be fewer businesses started. There'll be fewer open accounts that will be allowed, and fewer transactions. And so in the end, it'll suppress our free enterprise.
Yeah, and if you're a taxpayer, taxpayers are already on the hook for trillions. I mean, we are as a nation on the hook for about $12.8 trillion as a nation. The bailout of Wall Street bill cost over $700 billion. There's other authorities being used by the federal government to loan money to bail out businesses. AIG is a great example. So how do you think that affects the average taxpayer, too?
Well, we're carrying all this debt now. Yeah. And I would add this debt up. I'd go back to the $700 billion that you mentioned in the TARP funding. And another big chunk of debt is the $787 billion in economic stimulus plan. Yeah. I can't count the hundreds of billions that have been spun off by the Treasury and just to prop up places where they found the authority they think to do that. And so when you just think it to the small business side of this, if you have a business that has to borrow a lot of money, and let's say they're damaged by a flood or some natural disaster, and small business comes in and loans them $1 million at 4% loan. Well, it's nice to have the capital, but you still have to pay the interest. You still have to service the principal. You have to carry that load. So that's the case for the federal government, too. Governments and businesses are the same. They're different in size, but they're the same in how they react. All of this money that has been borrowed has to be paid back, if it is and when it is, and then we have to pay the interest and the principal on that. That means that our recovery is going to be a lot longer than it would have been otherwise.
Now, you hear a lot of talk about too big to fail and all these big institutions, Goldman Sachs and all these massive entities in Wall Street, these big banks. But what about small businesses? Because small businesses are overlooked. They aren't going to get bailed out by any of these funds because they don't have the lobbyists coming to Washington, D.C. and lobbying for them and getting them all this great influence that clearly some of the big businesses